Does the size of your painting affect how good it turns out? I've been painting for over 2 decades, and it wasn't until very recently that I finally realized that yes, it does. Size affects two things. Number one, space. You will either have more space or less space to incorporate the details you're looking to paint. And specifically with watercolor, if you incorporate watery techniques and embrace a looser style, you will have a significantly harder time trying to achieve those watery techniques in a smaller scale. Number two, texture. Watercolor paper has a texture. If you're working smaller, that texture will appear to be more pronounced. But I would say that aspect of scale isn't nearly as important as the aspect of space. I am a huge fan of painting big. And even though we just discussed two ways that scale impacts how your painting turns out, if I had to narrow it down, I only paint big for one reason, because I love water. I use a lot of water in my paintings. And I was finding when I was painting smaller, I was getting very frustrated with my limited ability to let those watery techniques shine in my portraiture. I wanted to do things that I just could not do in a smaller scale. Let's look at this portrait of Hazel. Both of these portraits are proportionally accurate. They both have color, contrast, a light side and a dark side, and even incorporate in-focus details and looser abstract areas. Technically, they have all the components that I like to teach, all three principles of color, contrast, and composition. So then why does the larger version of Hazel's portrait look so much better? And it boils down to the same reasons we discussed at the beginning. It has more room for the detail, so there's more detail, and it has more room for the watery techniques, so it's just more interesting. Now, some could argue that you could still achieve a good level of detail simply using smaller tools and brushes. And that is true, to an extent. I personally do not want to be spending a ton of time working small areas of detail with really small brushes. For me, that feels constricting and kind of frustrating. The difference of detail between Hazel's eyes in these two examples is just night and day. The level of detail is just so much better in the larger portrait. I also think the watery techniques that I was able to achieve in the larger portrait look so good and bring the entire portrait to life. The same is true for this portrait of Zeus. I achieved a lot more detail, especially in the eyes, and his whole portrait incorporates beautiful watery techniques in the larger version that I just was not able to get in the smaller one. I originally offered a smaller option for my custom pet portraits for affordability reasons. But my heart would always sink a little bit when I actually got an order for one of those, because I knew it was going to be harder for me to paint it small. It literally is harder for me to paint a small portrait than a bigger one, and it takes about the same amount of time. However, my costs are larger with the larger portrait. Paper cost is higher and shipping cost is higher. It also takes me more time to trace it and more time to scan it. So if you do custom pet portraits, just consider those three things as well: tracing, scanning if you scan, and framing. Right now I offer one size, 22 inches by 28 inches, which is a standard frame size here in the United States. So if my clients want to frame it cheaply, they will be able to do that. I know some artists too are actually intimidated or maybe nervous to try painting bigger, but now that you know that it actually can be easier, especially to achieve these watery techniques that maybe you're struggling with. And you know what? Maybe it's not your fault. Maybe it's because you're just not working big enough for the water to work its magic in your paint. And how cool would it be if not only you broke through the barrier and started painting big with success, but at the same time, you started achieving success with those watery techniques. Big paper can be expensive. And I remember when I first started painting on really nice paper, I was so nervous to waste it if my painting didn't turn out. If you're in that boat, there are 3 things I would suggest for you. Number 1 is to practice the watery techniques on smaller paper. Now I know that sounds a little bit backwards, but if you're using an entire sheet of small paper, even 9 by 12, for one technique, that will be plenty of space to make that watery technique happen. Number 2 is to look into more affordable options. New York Central Art Supply at Jerry's Artorama is a really affordable and high quality watercolor paper option. And they make it in all kinds of sizes, including 16 by 20 sheets, full-size 22 by 30 sheets, and even really big long rolls. And number 3 is to not beat yourself up when you do fail, because you will, and I still do. You can see in this video, I had to redo 2 commissions. Unfortunately, failing is part of the journey, but that's kind of life, right? It's just failing is part of the journey. But if you look at failure as learning, it helps a lot. So I try not to take failures too personally. I let myself grieve a little bit and be sad for having that painting not turn out. But I try to shift my perspective from thinking that I wasted time and wasted supplies into I really learned a lot, and now this next painting will likely turn out much better. I hope this video encouraged you to try painting big. Grab your supply list at paint333.com and keep painting along with me. I'm really happy you're here, and I wish you very happy painting.